Note, in the following sections, all examples of vocabulary appear in the modern spelling. Historical development. Russian is a Slavic language of the Indo-European family. All Indo-European languages are descendants of a single prehistoric language, reconstructed as Proto-Indo-European, spoken sometime in the Neolithic era. Although no written records remain, much of the culture and religion of the Proto-Indo-European people can also be reconstructed based on the daughter cultures traditionally and continuing to inhabit most of Europe and South Asia, areas to where the Proto-Indo-Europeans migrated from their original homeland. Several disputed proposals link Indo-European to other major language families. Kievan period and feudal breakup. Up to the 14th century, ancestors of the modern Russians spoke dialects of the Old East Slavic language, related to the dialects of other East Slavics. This spoken tongue and the literary Old Church Slavonic language operated throughout Kievan Rus. The earliest written record of the language, an amphora found at Gniezdovo, may date from the mid-10th century. For the debate concerning derivation of the words Rus and Russia, see etymology of Rus and derivatives and Rus. For the general history of the language and Old East Slavic literature, see Old East Slavic language. During the pre-Kievan period, the main sources of borrowings were Germanic languages, particularly Gothic and Old Norse. In the Kievan period, however, loanwords and calques entered the vernacular primarily from Old Church Slavonic and from Byzantine Greek. After the Mongol invasion of Rus in the 13th century, the vernacular language of the conquered peoples remained firmly Slavic. Turco-Mongol borrowings in Russian relate mostly to commerce and the military. In Russia, Church Slavonic, which evolved from Old Church Slavonic, remained the literary language until the Petrine Age, when its usage shrank drastically to biblical and liturgical texts. Legal acts and private letters had been, however, already written in pre-Petrine Muscovy in a less formal language, more closely reflecting spoken Russian. The first grammar of the Russian language was written by Vasily Adorjirov in the 1740s, and a more influential one by Mikhail Lomonosov in 1755. The Moscow period. After the disestablishment of the Tatar yoke in the late 14th century, both the political center and the predominant dialect in European Russia came to be based in Moscow. A scientific consensus exists that Russian and Ruthenian had definitely become distinct by this time at the latest. The official language in Russia remained a kind of Church Slavonic until the close of the 18th century, but, despite attempts at standardization, as by Meletius Motheritsky c. 1620, its purity was by then strongly compromised by an incipient secular literature. Vocabulary was borrowed from Polish and, through it, from German and other Western European languages. At the same time, a number of words of native coinage or adaptation appeared, at times replacing or supplementing the inherited Indo-European, common Slavonic vocabulary. Much analytic, hagiographic, and poetic material survives from the early Muscovite period. Nonetheless, a significant amount of philosophic and secular literature is known to have been destroyed after being proclaimed heretical. The material following the election of the Romanov dynasty in 1613 following the time of troubles is rather more complete. Modern Russian literature is considered to have begun in the 17th century, with the autobiography of Avvakum and a corpus of chroniques scandaleuses, short stories from Moscow Empire. The political reforms of Peter the Great were accompanied by a reform of the alphabet, and achieved the goal of secularization and modernization. Blocks of specialized vocabulary were adopted from the languages of Western Europe. Most of the modern naval vocabulary, for example, is of Dutch origin. Latin, French, and German words entered Russian for the intellectual categories of the Age of Enlightenment. Greek words already in the language through Church Slavonic were refashioned to reflect post-Renaissance European rather than Byzantine pronunciation. By 1800, a significant portion of the gentry spoke French, less often German, on an everyday basis. At the same time, there began explicit attempts to fashion a modern literary language as a compromise between Church Slavonic, the native vernacular, and the style of Western Europe. The writers Lomonosov, Derzhavin, and Karamzin made notable efforts in this respect, but, as per the received notion, the final synthesis belongs to Pushkin and his contemporaries in the first third of the 19th century. During the 19th century, the standard language assumed its modern form. Literature flourished, spurred perhaps by the so-called Slavophilism. Some terms from other languages fashionable during the 18th century now passed out of use, and formerly vernacular or dialectal strata entered the literature as the speech of the people. Borrowings of political, scientific and technical terminology continued. By about 1900, commerce and fashion ensured the first wave of mass adoptions from German, French and English. Soviet period and beyond. The political upheavals of the early 20th century and the wholesale changes of political ideology gave written Russian its modern appearance after the spelling reform of 1918. Reformed spelling, the new political terminology, and the abandonment of the effusive formulae of politeness characteristic of the pre-revolutionary upper classes prompted dire statements from members of the émigré intelligentsia that Russian was becoming debased. But the authoritarian nature of the regime, the system of schooling it provided from the 1930s, and not least the often unexpressed yearning among the literati for the former days ensured a fairly static maintenance of Russian into the 1980s. Though the language did evolve, it changed very gradually. Indeed, while literacy became nearly universal, dialectal differentiation declined, especially in the vocabulary. Schooling and mass communications ensured a common denominator. The 1964 proposed reform was related to the orthography. In that year, the Orthographic Commission of the Institute of the Russian Language, headed by Viktor Vinogradov, apart from the withdrawal of some spelling exceptions, suggested retaining one partitive soft sign. Always writing I after to C, writing O after ZH, J, sha to C if stressed or ye if not. Not writing the soft sign after ZH, sha, J, sha, cancelling the interchange in roots zor, rast, rost, gar, gor, plav, plov, etc. Cancelling the double consonants in loan words, writing only yensk instead of two suffixes insk and yensk, write only yes instead of yes or its, simplifying the spelling of n in participles, write double n in prefixal participles and ordinary n in non-prefixal, always writing with hyphen the pol combinations with subsequent genitive of noun or ordinal number, writing the nouns beginning with vice and to x together, writing all particles separately, allowing the optional spelling of noun inflections. The reform, however, failed to take root. Political circumstances and the undoubted accomplishments of the superpower in military, scientific, and technological matters gave Russian a worldwide, if occasionally grudging, prestige, most strongly felt during the middle third of the 20th century. The political collapse of 1990-1991 991 loosened the shackles. In the face of economic uncertainties and difficulties within the educational system, the language changed rapidly. There was a wave of adoptions, mostly from English, and sometimes for words with exact native equivalents. At the same time, the growing public presence of the Russian Orthodox Church and public debate about the history of the nation gave new impetus to the most archaic, Church Slavonic stratum of the language, and introduced or reintroduced words and concepts that replicate the linguistic models of the earliest period. Russian today is a tongue in great flux. The new words entering the language and the emerging new styles of expression have, naturally, not been received with universal appreciation. Examples. The following excerpts illustrate the development of the literary language. Spelling has been partly modernized. The translations are as literal as possible, rather than literary. Primary Chronicle c. 1110, from the Laurentian Codex, 1377. These the tales of the bygone years, whence is come the Russian land, who first began to rule at Kiev, and whence the Russian land has come about. Old East Slavic, the common ancestor of Russian, Ukrainian and Belarusian. Fall of the years in progress or arguably complete. Southwestern features include bygone, modern correct use of perfect and aorist, is, has come, began. Note the style of punctuation. The Tale of Igor's Campaign, c. 1200, from the Catherine manuscript, c. 1790. Would it not be meet, O brothers, for us to begin with the old words, the difficult telling of the host of Igor, Svятoslavich, and to begin in the way of the true tales of this time, and not in the way of Boyan's inventions? For the wise Boyan, if he wished to devote to someone's song, would wander like a squirrel over a tree, like a grey wolf over land, like a bluish eagle beneath the clouds. Illustrates the song epics. She has generally given full voicing, unlike in the first printed edition of 1800, which was copied from the same destroyed prototype as the Catherine manuscript. Typical use of metaphor and simile. The misquote has become proverbial in the meaning, to speak ornately, at length, excessively. Avakum's Autobiography, 1672-73. Modernized spelling. And then they sent me to Siberia with my wife and children. Whatever hardship there was on the way, there's too much to say it all, but maybe a small part to be mentioned. Gave birth to a baby, and we carted her, sick, all the way to Tobolsk for 3,000 versts, around 13 weeks in all. We dragged by car, and by water, and in a sleigh half of the way. Pure 17th century Central Russian vernacular. Phonetic spelling. A few archaisms still used. Note the way of transport to exile. Alexander Pushkin from Winter Evening, 1825. Modern spelling. Listen. Tempest covers sky in haze, twisting gales full of snow, like a beast begins to howl, a cry, as if a child, it will let go. On the worn-out roof it will clamor suddenly upon the thatch, or as though a traveler tardy starts to knock upon our hatch. Modern Russian is sometimes said to begin with Pushkin, in the sense that the old, high-style, Church Slavonic and vernacular Russian are so closely fused that it is difficult to identify whether any given word or phrase stems from the one or the other. Fyodor Dostoevsky from Crime and Punishment, 1866. Modern spelling. In early July, during a spell of extraordinary heat, towards evening, a young man went out from his garret which he sublet in S. Lane, the street, and slowly, as though in indecision, began to make his way to K. Bridge, 19th century prose. No archaisms. European syntax. Fundamental Laws of the Russian Empire, 1906. Modern spelling. To the Emperor of all Russia belongs the supreme autocratic power. To obey his power, not merely in fear, but also in conscience, God himself does ordain, illustrates the categorical nature of thought and expression in the official circles of the Russian Empire, exemplifies the syntactic distribution of emphasis. Mikhail Bulgakov, for The Master and Margarita, 1930-40. You have always been a passionate proponent of the theory that upon decapitation human life comes to an end, the human being transforms into ashes, and passes into oblivion. I am pleased to inform you, in the presence of my guests, though they serve as a proof for another theory altogether, that your theory is both well-grounded and ingenious. Mind you, all theories are worth one another. Among them is one, according to which every one shall receive in line with his faith. May that come to be an example of highly educated modern speech. See Russian humor for the essential other end of the spectrum.